everyone from a lovely sunny Dublin here in Ireland, and good evening to all those joining us from the other side of the world. Welcome to our Morgan McKinley webinar on emotional intelligence and high performance individuals. I'm Tara Clancy, Senior Marketing Executive here for Morgan McKinley Ireland. Before we get started, I'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone who took the time to join us today. We've had a fantastic response to this webinar with over 2,000 people registered worldwide, and we have a great number of people in attendance at the moment. So just to begin with a little bit of housekeeping, if you can't hear us, you can listen in using one of these two devices, phone or computer or tablet. Speakers or headphones, make sure these are plugged in and turned on. To use your phone, if you prefer to use your phone, you must select Use Phone and use the relevant number for your region as found in the email invite. Questions on logging in, please contact our events@morganmckinley.com email. Questions will be taken via the question or chat feature on your webinar control panel and will be answered by Alan. Alan's responses will be shared via email after the webinar. If you have any questions throughout the webinar or post-webinar, please email events@morganmckinley.com. So quickly, what we'll be running through today, we'll be covering the history of EI, which is emotional intelligence, why EI matters, EI in sport, leadership and reality TV, and most importantly, how to develop your emotional intelligence. Okay, so today Alan has very kindly decided to give away a free EQ-i 2.0 psychometric assessment test and feedback session. So all you have to do is simply tweet your favorite quote from the webinar using the hashtag #SuccessSeries and you'll be entered into the draw. Please remember to use the hashtag #SuccessSeries, otherwise you will not be entered into the draw and the winner will be revealed after the webinar via email. Okay, so a bit about today's host, Alan Lyons. Alan has practiced as a professional psychologist for over 15 years. He belongs to both the Division of Work and Organisational Psychology and Division of Counselling Psychology within the Physiological Society of Ireland. Alan is a qualified coaching and psychologist and a founding member of the Society of Coaching Psychology within the British Physiological Society. He is also a recognised professional member and accredited sports psychologist by the Irish Institute of Sport. Alan assists individuals, teams and their leaders to implement the paradigm-shifting ideas contained within the best-selling book iChange. He is passionate about helping people to perform at their optimal level, leveraging emotional intelligence, clarifying purpose, disciplined execution, and enhancing mental toughness. He delivers coaching programs globally in a role as MHS EQ-i 2.0 Master Trainer. So without further ado, Alan, I shall pass you over and hope you all enjoy the webinar.
Okay, thank you, Tara. So as Tara was saying there, we're business psychologists with Kinch Lyons. Just to give you a sense of the approach we use positive psychology. Now you might be wondering what positive psychology is. Emotional intelligence is a key component of positive psychology. So most psychology up until the mid-80s was based on really what was not working well in people's lives. What had you not functioning? The science behind what had you feeling that your life lacked meaning, that you didn't want to get up in the morning. It came from the paradigm that Freud left us with, that the most we could ever really hope to achieve in life would be to alleviate despair. Well, a big shift in psychology came then when they looked at actually, hold on, what are the scientific conditions under which people flourish? What makes you want to get up in the morning? What do you enjoy about yourself? What gives your life meaning? And the science behind that is actually more useful to people than the science of what is not working in your life. The emotional intelligence piece is one of the key components of positive psychology. So let's have a look at the history of where emotional intelligence is coming from. Most people on the line might feel they have a sense of what it is, but I often find when I'm doing a lot of coaching, people will often come and the first thing we ask them is, what would you like from this session? And quite often they will say, I would like to be more emotionally intelligent. But then when we inquire how they would know they were more emotionally intelligent, quite often the response is, I actually don't know what it is. I've just been told that I need more of it. So actually in organizations today, we find that it's nearly been used as an insult for people. So Let me explore today with you what it is. This is a book that put emotional intelligence on the map, written by Daniel Goleman. It says why it can matter more than IQ. So most people, most HR people listening today will have this book. However, most people do not get past chapter 3. That's because it goes into the neuroscience and people switch off. However, Daniel Goleman has actually written a book, or an article, should I say, for the Harvard Business Review called What Makes a Leader? And it is the biggest selling reprint of any Harvard Business Review article ever. How come? I often think it's because most people can't get through his book, but they find what they need from the article. If you Google it, it will come up. Why it can matter more than IQ, great title. HR people get carried away as well. They think IQ is not important, it's emotional intelligence. IQ is very important, but it's very much a price of entry into an organization. The argument in the book put forward is once within an organization, it's actually your levels of emotional intelligence which makes the difference. So just briefly, what is the history of emotional intelligence? Well, you will see there in 83, Reuven Bar-On, an American-Israeli psychologist, was looking at well-being. He had originally been studying items to measure attention deficit disorder when he actually had the brainwave that nobody had actually been looking at items or measurements in high performance or well-being. So Reuven Bar-On was the first to really look at the emotional intelligence as a construct. Howard Gardner, about the same time, was doing work into the idea of multiple intelligences, whereby in school, most people are rewarded for academic ability, their smarts. However, there's many different forms of intelligence, which Howard Gardner was pointing out. Somebody who may be very good at football could well have kinesthetic intelligence. However, the feedback from the teachers to the parents is often your little Johnny isn't that clever or good or bright. However, they're good with a bit of grass. They're good at football, rather than actually seeing that as a form of kinesthetic intelligence. Similarly, somebody who's good in the art workshop could very well have artistic intelligence, but might be perceived not to be intelligent because of the academic ability. Howard Gardner also identified emotional and social intelligence, and that is the one that we're looking at today, and that has been proven since 83 to be highly predictive of how well you'll get on in life and indeed in organizations. Then you see in the 90s, John Mayer and Peter Salovey were also looking at emotional intelligence, specifically in terms of how to measure it. And then Daniel Goleman, as I showed you in the previous slide, very much popularized the space in his book. Okay, so let's have a quick look at a couple of definitions from the thought leaders. Daniel Goleman says, it is the capacity for recognizing our own feelings and those of others, for motivating ourselves, and for managing emotions well in ourselves and in our relationships. Reuven Bar-On, who is the author of the most scientifically proven measurement of emotional intelligence, a model of which I will bring you through shortly, his definition is emotional social intelligence is a cross-section of interrelated emotional and social competencies, skills and facilitators that determine how effectively we understand and express ourselves, understand others and relate with them, and cope with daily demands. My one here, to simplify it, is essentially it's be yourself more with skill. The whole emphasis of positive psychology and emotional intelligence, it's not about a quick win or trying to create a new, different you, pretending to be somebody else. Rather, it is seeking to tap into what works for you authentically and amplify that. We'll all use it differently. We're all different people, and that's useful. Rather than those pop psychology books who we get very jealous of. They're very different than positive psychology. Pop psychology books are the books that sell very well every Christmas time in the airport. However, a lot of what's in those books doesn't work. Why is that? Because it's about trying to make you behave in a way that's not aligned with who you are. You do it for a couple of weeks and then you say, I am going back to being myself. The difference in positive psychology, it's authentically tapping into what works for you so you can do more of it. Hence, be yourself more with skill rather than trying to pretend to be somebody else. Now, I mentioned most people switch off when we look and talk about the neuroscience, but it is interesting to note that actually by developing your emotional intelligence, you're actually rewiring parts of the neuroplasticity in your brain. So you will see there at the right-hand side, it looks at that big bubble there is an area called your amygdala. It's where we react to situations. It's where we have primitive emotional brain. It says we have instincts, reaction based on emotions and impulses. If you will, our five senses, how you see, feel, touch, hear, smell, come in at the top of our spinal cord into our amygdala first. So that is actually saying we have an emotional reaction to every single sense before it makes its way across the limbic system in our brain into what is called the prefrontal cortex, often referred to as the executive functioning part of our brain. And that's when we start to think in terms of logic, planning, attention, self-control, choices, follow through. So if you will, what they've proven in emotionally intelligent people is that they've strengthened the neurological muscles between those two areas. So the prefrontal cortex is tapped into quicker. Now, the emotional part of our brain, if that flares up, it's often referred to as the amygdala hijack or an emotional hijack. It takes us longer to tap into our logical part. In fact, the prefrontal cortex is only 20 million or so years old, which is quite new in relative terms. The amygdala, however, where is always looking out for threats and fear, that has always been there. So when we stepped out of the cave 30 million years ago, we didn't need to think logically. We didn't need a prefrontal cortex. If a lion was coming at you, you didn't need to wonder what breed it was or take anything else in. In fact, if you did that, we probably wouldn't have evolved because we would have been caught by the lion. So if you will, what all emotionally intelligent people are doing, they're not having as many emotional hijacks and they're tapping into the prefrontal cortex earlier. So what is this emotional hijack? Well, you might be familiar with these. People have them. They call them red mist moments. When you feel that you're out of control, you have an emotional reaction to everything. And it's only when you calm down, you get to think logically. Interesting, if you wake up in the middle of the night, when you go to sleep, your prefrontal cortex also powers down. So actually, that's quite often when you're having an emotional reaction to everything you're thinking about. And it's only in the morning when you're having your coffee and you realize it's not such a big deal. That's because you're thinking more logically. So is the solution to get up in the middle of the night and have a coffee? Perhaps not, but even being aware that your prefrontal cortex isn't on high alert like your amygdala can be helpful. People often have emotional hijacks. Think of when you had a red mist moment in a road rage incident where you were driving down the road and you reacted. And it's only when you calm down afterwards and you think maybe you overcooked it. Here's some famous ones. This was the karate kick from Cantona. Another one, Zidane with the headbutt at the end of the match. This is a Ulster rugby player, Trevor Brennan, who broke a fan's jaw. Now, all of these are emotional hijacks. What's interesting is if you listen to any of these players talking about these moments, they find it difficult. Even in their autobiographies, they gloss over it. Why is that? Well, it's like a red mist moment. It would be like somebody wanting to interview yourself on an emotional hijack you've had, a road rage incident you've had. You probably like to feel that it wasn't defining of who you are as a person. And similarly, that's what happens with the examples there. Now, what is the difference between emotional intelligence and IQ and personality? Well, IQ and personality is what psychologists have used for years. In fact, when you looked at the idea of emotions, psychologists in the early 80s would say, well, emotions are some part of an interplay with personality. Really what they were saying is we actually aren't sure how to put a construct around it, or even if it is desirable of a construct. Now you can see a huge shift whereby it's been identified and actually the key emotional intelligence skills have been identified that we can all leverage. IQ and personality remain relatively stable in terms of how we measure it. So if you measure my IQ today and I wasn't happy with it, well, the only feedback you can give me is, well, have an awareness around it. And your personality really only changes by about a percentage over a lifetime. Now, that's obviously debated. like a nurture-nature debate in psychology, but essentially in terms of the measurement piece, IQ and personality remain relatively stable. However, emotional intelligence, something that could be derailing you in your career, it is very much flexible and open to change, as I've just shown you with the neuroplasticity, etc. So you can rewire parts of your brain so you can respond in a stronger, more mentally tough way. Now, this is interesting. As you get older, you also develop stronger emotional intelligence, which makes sense. Now, it does drop off after 50, like most things in life. However, when you're developing and you're getting older in life, you are learning how to cope. You are developing skills. Now, what we're trying to do, if you will, a lot of elite athletes are only of an age from about 18 to 22. So we're actually trying to, in a lot of sports psychology, is about accelerating that learning, because often it is this space that derails elite athletes. I'll show you here EQ in sports. There's a theory of performance in sports leadership, which is as follows. The player must have the talent. Absolutely. A lot of that is innate. Skills, absolutely. A lot of that comes about from deliberate practice. However, if the athlete is not managing their emotions well, they're unlikely to be at an ideal performance state. So that is why you will often see a coach not select a player, not because of their talent, not because they're not doing deliberate practice, skill development. However, they will have identified that there's something not quite right with the athlete's confidence or emotions. And they know that if that is the case, they're unlikely to be at their ideal performance state. If you will, if we look at this in a work context, the talent is very much the IQ, and the skill is being open to getting better. That's the price of entry into most organizations today. However, if you want full engagement from an employee or yourself, it's the EQ and managing yourself well in that space which will predict whether you'll be at your ideal performance state. EQ is at play everywhere. Interesting one about reality TV. I'm not sure if any of you watch it or would admit to, but here's some big ones. Survivor, Big Brother, The Apprentice. Now, these reality TV shows have psychologists in assessing the participants. Yes, to make sure that their mental well-being is strong enough to enter the shows, but also what's interesting is we also have the IQ, personality, and EQ results of all the participants. So they can play with them a bit, whereby they might put in to Big Brother somebody with high IQ, low EQ, and vice versa, to give the car crash TV, which has been so successful. What is interesting, however, is that we also have the results, the psychometrics, which we can look at post the TV shows. And never once has the person with the highest IQ won The Apprentice. It's always been the person with the highest EQ. Now, Stephen Covey, who you might be familiar with, wrote the best-selling business book of all time called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Interestingly, Stephen's also, when he's passed away a couple of years ago, but he was showing at the time of his death how the development of the 7 habits also helped you enhance your emotional intelligence. So there's a lot of alignment between the work. His quote is, research shows convincingly that EQ is more important than IQ in almost every role, and many times more important in leadership roles. This finding is accentuated as we move from the control philosophy of the industrial age, so that's the control and command, to an empowering release philosophy of the knowledge worker age, which we all are. So how you engage and develop knowledge age workers is really through the development of emotional intelligence. So have a reflection point. If you're with somebody, have a little chat with them around this question. Think of a leader who you believe has strong emotional intelligence. Okay, I'll show you some classic examples from the EQ research. Martin Luther King. Life's most persistent and urgent questions is, what are you doing for others? Mother Teresa, we'll never know all the good that a simple smile can do. Gandhi, he's given a lot to this space. His famous quote, be the change you want to see. As human beings, our greatness is not as much in being able to remake the world as being able to remake ourselves. We can't change other people, but by changing ourselves, we might elicit different responses from them. Steve Jobs, who very much wouldn't have started out with strong emotional intelligence by all accounts from people who worked with him. However, he did develop it throughout his career. And his quote is, "Being the richest man in the cemetery doesn't matter to me. Going to bed is saying we've done something wonderful. That's what matters to me." Richard Branson, "You can't be a good leader unless you generally like people. That's how you bring out the best in them." And nobody would deny that he also likes himself, which is very useful for him. Jack Welch, CEO of GE, biggest company for many years, he stated, "Emotional intelligence is more rare than book smarts, but my experience says it's actually more important in the making of a leader." Okay, I will now show you a construct, a model called the EQ-i2 based on the original work of Reuven Bar-On. It is owned by the test publishers MHS, who are traditionally clinical and educational test publishers, which is interesting. So they bring a very robust scientific approach to their measurements. One of their measurements in North America would be taken by people in jail who were looking for parole, and you must score well in one of their assessments to show that you'd be suitable for it. So you can see the kind of clinical approach that MHS have to take to their assessments, and I've taken the same to this EQ-i too. Many psychologists have worked over the years on it, and what they've identified is 5 specific areas that highly emotionally intelligent people are strong in. They are self-perception, self-expression, interpersonal, decision-making, stress management. And then underneath each of those components, there's 3 factors. Now, there's 15 altogether, but it's not a case of I'd have to go out and develop 15 factors to become more emotionally intelligent. Even by developing 1 or 2, like a spider's web, it enhances the other ones out. We'll go through them as a brief snapshot now, but just to also be mindful that they all work interrelated together. Okay, so that's to be mindful of it. So self-perception, what comes in there? Well, underneath self-perception, which is intrapersonal, so it's very much what's happening for you under the bonnet. Most training and development skips this piece because people feel uncomfortable going there. So if you will, the emotional intelligence very much goes to the roots of effectiveness, looks at what's going on for you underneath. And if you have strong foundations, that makes you better at interacting with other people. The first one up here is self-regard. So that's your confidence, being able to reflect back on your achievements, being mindful of your weaknesses, but using them to leverage your well-being going forward. Self-actualization, back to Maslow's hierarchical theory, the first motivational theory. What gives you meaning and purpose in life? And this is one of the biggest motivators, especially for knowledge age workers. Do you feel that your job allows you to make a unique, authentic contribution? And the emotional self-awareness, if you will, Carl Rogers said, change happens where the awareness is. But first of all, we have to be aware. So even discussing emotional intelligence with people can enhance their emotional intelligence. Might sound a bit strange, however, it makes sense because you're becoming more aware of how you behave and respond. And if there's a different way of behaving, that might give you a different result. So self-regard, often when we look at self-regard, we talk about developing your strengths or flow moments. Now, what is a flow moment? Well, a flow moment is a true strength for you. It's when you're working on something that you just feel completely engaged in. People describe flow moments as I was nearly watching myself. It was nearly cartoon-like. I was doing something that just made me feel strong and brilliant. Now, some people never actually take the time out to analyze when they're in flow moments. And a lot of times people get mistaken between strengths and competencies. A competency is something you're good at. However, a strength is something that makes you feel good. They can obviously overlap a lot, but sometimes they don't. And you will see this is the work of psychologist, big positive psychologist called Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, and he has identified to be in a flow moment, you need the right level of challenge by skill. If the challenge is too much, you will not be in the flow as you will slip into anxiety. But similarly, if your skill is too much for what you're doing, you're likely to be bored, which will take you away from being in the flow. And indeed, boredom at the extreme can also lead to anxiety. Most people think of elite athletes when we talk about flow moments. They say, well, that's fine, but I work in an office. Well, what's interesting is elite athletes have just spent time identifying the conditions that create flow moments for them. The research actually shows that you're much more likely to have a flow moment in work. However, we're less likely to take account of it. Think of yourself when you're going home this evening, on your bus, your train, in your car. Are you reflecting on what made you feel in the flow during your day? Are you reflecting on the couple of things you didn't get done or the couple of interactions which you didn't think went well? Well, you would do very well if you want to develop your self-regard to think about actually what went well today. When was I making a contribution? The self-actualization piece. The other piece underneath the self-perception is around awareness. And if you will, self-awareness is a key to leadership development. Being aware of how you behave and the impact it has on others. Still intrapersonal space, but it's how you communicate your understanding and your feelings. It's the self-expression. Underneath here is emotional expression, the impact you make on other people. And remember, people by people. When we look at emotional expression, we talk about people generally do not remember what you were talking about. However, they will remember how you made them feel. And this is the very important piece. They'll remember how you made them feel, not necessarily the content. The assertiveness in emotional intelligence is slightly different than dominance from the personality. The assertiveness is being able to communicate feelings in a way that lands on another person that doesn't make them feel awkward or small. And then the independence of mind. Are you focused on what you need to get right? Elite athletes are very strong at this. They're very focused on their PBs, their personal bests, and they're focused on what they can do better rather than being dependent on anything that's outside of their control. And an interesting research by a palliative care nurse in Australia a couple of years ago, she was interviewing elderly people in a nursing home, asking them what were their biggest regrets in life. Interesting, her research showed that the number one biggest regret people had just before they left this planet was, if I could live my life again, I wouldn't care what other people thought so much. So many of us make decisions based on what we think other people would like us to do. And when we're about to leave, we wish we hadn't have done that. It's interesting. The emotional expression, when you're communicating with people, we call this the 93% rule. 93% of what you're communicating is body language and tone. And this is why when I used to do a lot of couple counseling, it was normally the man would turn around and say, all I said to her was. This was a beautiful piece for them to realize that actually that was 7% of what they were communicating. There was a whole other emotional expression made up of the 93%, which could be useful for them to be aware of. This is an interesting research. The first US presidential debate to be televised ever was between Nixon and JFK. You could watch this on YouTube after this webinar, if you like. What's interesting is when everybody was interviewed afterwards about who won, most people that who had listened to it on the radio, which was most people at the time, believed that Nixon outright won the presidential debate. However, the majority of people who watched the live presidential debate believed that JFK won it. What was going on there? Well, if you listen to it, we didn't pick up on a lot of the emotional expression of Nixon. He did the classic when he lied, he touched his nose, he was sweating, he was rubbing his brow, he wasn't looking into the camera, his body language was fidgety, whereby if you look at JFK, he looks open, he looks like you could trust him, he's staring directly into the camera, and we picked up a lot more on the emotional expression. However, the bad news is, even if our politicians today are lying, they've learned how to look like JFK. But this was before Nixon had been given such coaching, which could have saved him. And why do people become less independent of mind? Well, it's because non-conforming makes us anxious. This is why the whistleblowers during the banking crisis, etc. Why wasn't there more of them? Because people feel anxious when they're going against the norm. That stops them being as independent. So the two dimensions we've looked at so far are self-perception and self-expression. You can kind of think, where am I good there? Which other areas do I think could be useful for me to develop? But I'd only like you to leave this webinar with one or two areas, because if you take more than that, it's unlikely to be as successful for you. In the interpersonal space, and this is where a lot more training and development is more comfortable, it's in interpersonal relationships, empathy, which is huge. Being empathic with somebody is the strongest and fastest way to make a connection with them. And then social responsibility is around not just what you have to do, but being able to coach others and being involved in teams and group work outside of immediate gratification. Now, just to show you how these might interplay, if I was given feedback at work that I needed to be better with other people, you might think, okay, work on my interpersonal relationships. However, what you might find is that it was something to do with my low self-regard. So my low confidence was actually stopping me from being able to network, connect with other people. So by developing my self-regard, it would also have the knock-on effect of leading me to be stronger in terms of interpersonal relationships with others. So empathy is huge. Most people do not listen to other people. What do? Well, most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. An example would be when you go home this evening, and if somebody you live with, a partner or a housemate, says to you, the traffic was really bad from where they were working, how do you respond? You're more than likely to say, you should have seen the traffic from where my office was, rather than actually empathically responding to the people. Most people listen with the intent, with pretending to understand, but they're just trying to fix things. An example I'd use, I have a 7-year-old little girl, and she could come into me after school and say to me, Daddy, Julia was pulling my hair. Now, an empathic response there is what has been asked for. An empathic response would be, that must feel terrible. However, being the dad, wanting to fix things, I am more likely to say, okay, the next time Julia does that, you pull her hair back. Or do you know what I did when I was your age? Which actually impacts my girl's amygdala, her emotional part of her brain, actually builds up this problem, makes it worse. Whereby if I just empathically responded, it is likely that she would bounce off and sort the whole thing out herself. Because people actually aren't asking for us to fix things. A lot of the times they're asking us to connect and listen. And this is where the whole helicopter parenting is impacting the development of children's emotional intelligence, whereby it is normal in a playground to get into a fight, but to be able to work it out and manage it as well without parents coming straight out and intervening. So they're not leaving the kids with any skills in conflict resolution or to be able to develop emotionally in this area. So I will show you a little funny clip, which is a couple at home. She wants to be understood and he wants to do the classic example of fix things. It should be starting in 1 second. Okay, that clip is also available on YouTube. A takeaway from today: when you go home tonight, the first person you meet tells you something, rather than replying but trying to fix it or saying anything, just empathically reply and see the difference it makes. Okay, so now we're going to look at decision making. Now, emotional decision making is a little bit different than, if you will, the aptitude side. It's made up of problem solving, reality testing, and impulse control. A lot of people can actually score quite badly in this area, but actually have a strong aptitude in terms of their problem solving ability, a PhD in engineering, etc. This is slightly different. This is how you manage your emotions during the problem-solving process, rather than your actual ability to, to be able to do so. And that's where there's quite a difference. The problem-solving: are you explosive? Are you engaging people around you? Are you able to focus on what matters most? That's the reality testing space. Are you just busy, or are you actually working on stuff that moves the game? Are you working on stuff that matters? Are you just busy in the chaos? People keep busy because it makes them feel productive. But actually, if you stand back, is it the most useful, the best use of your time? Impulse control. This is huge in emotional intelligence, and it's really the research into impulse control greatly helped the space, which we'll look at in a second. So what is happening with decision making? Well, there is a paradox, which is, in today's world, it is both easier and harder to achieve extraordinary productivity. People have more choices, more technology than ever before, but people are completing less than ever before. It's extraordinary. People who actually lived behind the Iron Curtain many years ago had more contentment than a lot of people today who have access and opportunity. Indeed, America is based on one of the principal foundations is about having options. Now, why is this? Technology was meant to make us all more connected. It was meant to make us all be able to work less. However, there's even syndromes now in psychology coming up called the never off syndrome. An email comes into your smartphone, and like a Pavlovian dog, you respond to it rather than connecting with the person you are. So we're overwhelmed. There's so much noise. This was only a few years ago. We were still juggling. However, the chaos of now. There's so much coming in. How do we identify what is most important? People feel overwhelmed. They feel exhausted. Interesting one I alluded to earlier in terms of impulse control on the marshmallow test. The marshmallow test is a famous psychology experiment by a French psychologist called Michel, who they give a marshmallow to 4-year-olds, and they ask the 4-year-olds to wait 15 minutes. And if they waited 15 minutes, they would be given a second marshmallow. 40% of the children waited. The other 60% scoffed that marshmallow. Now, what was interesting is when they followed those children up through their lives into their 20s, the 40% with higher impulse control at age 4 had all the better work well-being factors you'd want for your child. They had stronger jobs, less likely to have an addiction, more friendships, higher levels of well-being, everything that you'd want for your child. But they were able to predict this in a 4-year-old in terms of their levels of impulse control, being able to delay rather than get instant gratification and the impact it had. They followed those same 4-year-olds into their 40s, and when they did fMRI scanning, looking at brain imagery, they can see that they have stronger energy around their prefrontal cortex, the executive functioning part of the brain. All of us can develop it, but it's interesting, predictive at age 4. Now, this is the work of Jim Collins, who wrote Built to Last. What was interesting is if you take on 2 to 3 goals, the likelihood of achieving them with excellence are indeed 2 to 3. However, if you take on 4 to 10, what is the likelihood you'll achieve them with excellence? It drops dramatically to 1 to 2. If you then take on 11 to 20, what happens? 0. And this is what happens. People take on too much and they end up completing nothing People leave work and they wonder, how do I feel like I've nothing accomplished and I've been so busy all day? You're actually a lot better to just take on 2 to 3 things and complete them with excellence and then move on to the next. In psychology, there's research called the switching time, which shows that if you multitask, if you chip away at the 11 to 20 things, it actually takes you 25% longer to finish everything. So actually multitasking is not something we should be proud of. It's something we should actually try and diminish as much as we can. So the last one we're going to look at is around stress management. And a lot of people identify emotionally intelligent people in this space because they are people who can actually handle their work-life balance or work-life integration, if you will, a lot stronger. So the self-perception, self-expression, that's all about what's happening for you under the bonnet. Your ability then to connect with other people, that's the interpersonal space. How you handle your emotions when making decisions. And then lastly, your well-being. Your flexibility, your stress tolerance, optimistic mindset, which is very useful for your well-being, which we look at now. So what is the optimism? Well, how you view something, that's your mental map of the world or your paradigm, Greek word for your mental map of the world, will greatly influence your behavior and the results you get. So if you will, optimistic people are viewing possibilities. Optimistic people are responding better to setbacks. In psychology, we call it attribution theory. What is that? Well, optimistic people respond differently to setbacks in 3 ways than pessimistic people. They see them as less personal, they see them as less severe, and they see them as less permanent than more pessimistic people, which allows them to respond differently. Optimistic people are focusing on what could be different rather than getting obsessed about a problem. If you will, they are very much, if you will, dealers in hope. They're looking at, people say, but is optimism not just naivety? Actually, optimism in terms of leadership, when you're not sure where you're going, is actually, it's a strength. It is leadership. It's easier to say why something won't work. In fact, you'll often hear pessimistic people kick off the beginning of a meeting and say, that will never work, which actually impacts all of those people in the meeting. Optimistic people are also actually more realistic, because you'll find anytime you talk to a pessimistic person, they'll say, because they hate to be told they're pessimistic, they'll say, I am not pessimistic, I am realistic. But realistically, a solution might exist, but they will never find it because they don't believe there's any point trying, whereby the optimistic mindset is much more likely. It's also contagious. If you're being optimistic with people, they can pick up on that energy. And it greatly impacts what you will do and the results you will get. But you must challenge your paradigms, challenge people to be more optimistic. A great example of a paradigm shift we have in terms of changing the viewing to change the doing, the work of Carl Rogers, is this man here. This man here is Roger Bannister. What did he do? Well, in 54, he broke the 4-minute mile. Why was that impressive? Well, all the medical journals at the time stated it was impossible for a human to do a sub 4-minute mile. In fact, if you did, your heart would combust and you would be dead. So Roger Bannister challenged that paradigm, that mental map, and he accomplished it. He was a medical student himself at the time. He broke it down into doable chunks. But what really amazed the behavioral scientists at the time was that within 18 months, it was achieved by 39 other runners. Now, they didn't suddenly have access to Lance Armstrong's medical team. They didn't suddenly have a different way of running. He didn't have a different shoe. It was simply how he viewed it greatly impacted. Any one of those runners could have done it the same day as Bannister, but it just shows you the power of optimism, the power of how you view things. You can hold it back or it can greatly unleash you. So it's about challenging paradigms, and think of the paradigms we've been challenging over the years, from the banking crisis to challenging churches to challenging authority, etc. So the good news is we can all change habits. Martin Seligman is considered the father of positive psychology. He was the president of the American Psychological Association in the late 80s. Whoever has that tenure can very much influence where psychology goes. He stated habits of thinking need not be forever. Individuals can choose the way they think with the awareness piece. So everything we've looked at can be developed. Does this remind you? Do you see yourself here? People are overwhelmed in terms of stress tolerance, the coping mechanisms. You're never off, your smartphone, everything's always coming out with you. People are not intimate as much as they were. They're not even they're looking at screens rather than talking to partners. They're overwhelmed, stressed. Well, Tony Schwartz, sports psychologist, wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review many years ago called The Making of a Corporate Athlete. And in all stress tolerance or in all well-being literature we have in psychology, there's basically 4 energy drivers, 4 dimensions to your well-being. They are physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual. Some people prefer to call it the spiritual soul. It's really what gives you purpose or meaning. Now, what's interesting about these 4 areas is they are like 4 legs of a chair, in that if one of them is out of balance, it impacts the other. So if you're not looking after yourself physically, you won't feel as mentally sharp. If you're not feeling as mentally sharp, you won't feel as emotionally connected with yourself and other people, and therefore unlikely to find what you're working on meaningful. So you can see which areas now, as you're watching this, are you strong in? Which areas do you think you could improve in? If you quickly write down what one thing you will either stop, start, or continue doing in each of the 4 dimensions today, it would greatly help you if the stress management dimension of this construct is something you believe it could be useful for you to look at. So, just like your mum used to say, prevention is better than cure. All of this is better working on it before you need it. But most people only really look at interventions when they're trying to fix things. But just like it's easier to prevent a mental illness than to try and fix one, similarly with the emotional intelligence in organizations, going in, using it rather than when you need it is actually more impactful. And similarly, emotions respond just like muscles. The ones you stimulate the most become the strongest and most accessible. So everything we've looked at to date is useful. However, it's the practice of it where you will see the return. And it's a practice of it where you will actually developing new neural pathways and rewiring parts of the neuroplasticity of it, of your brain. And it's a practice of it that will actually, you'll see the benefit and feel you're in the flow and going towards your ideal performance state a lot more. This particular model, there's many models. This is the most scientifically robust model I've brought you through. People on the webinar who are HR professionals and L&D, you'd be familiar with the Kirkpatrick model. Level 1, the happy sheets, everybody always says it was great. Well, this was an evaluation they did in American Express, and you will see where we really want to see a shift is in level 4 because it's actually impacting results. And you will see level 4 here, it averaged 4.14 out of 5, agreed with the statement, I have seen an improvement in a business metric due to my work on EQ areas, which is great to see. As I said, most of them level 1, it's 5 out of 5, but you'd expect that. That's really just the level 1 is how much you'd like the facilitator and maybe even the lunch, but actually the level 4 is where it gets very meaty. So if you would like to become an authority in your emotional intelligence, we run certifications around the model. So if you are located in Ireland, there's one in the Psychological Society of Ireland. There's also virtual accreditation for wherever you are in the world, if that's something that would interest you. And then lastly, it's really just to thank you for your time. And I know I'm going to go back to Tara because there is a good few questions being asked. If we don't have the time now to answer them, we will answer them and then email them on to you. So Tara, back to you.
Wow, lots of food for thought there, Alan. I think it's fair to say we've all received some valuable emotional intelligence insights over the past hour. Personally, the points you made on stress management were very interesting and were definitely a few action points there to consider. So while the webinar has been in progress, Alan, we've had lots and lots of questions come in prior to the webinar and during. I've picked 3 here because we're just about running out of time. So John from Northampton, United Kingdom asked, how does EI differ from what was called EQ?
Great question. Emotional intelligence is EI. EQ was coined by Reuven Baron to mean emotional quotient. Now they're used a lot in the same context, but really we should be saying emotional intelligence unless we're specifically talking about somebody's quotient. However, people often say EQ meaning EI. So if you will, there's no difference, but where it comes from is Baron coining EQ. So they're used, if you will, in the same context. One's emotional intelligence and one's actually a specific quotient.
Great. That's great. Thanks, Alan. And thanks to John. Okay, so our second question is from Colleen in Singapore. Colleen asked how to stay calm in all situations.
How do you stay calm in all situations? Well, the 4 dimensions in the energy driver, if you think about them first, so you tap back into them, do breathing, stay focused. Mindfulness is also, if you're familiar with that, is a direct route to developing emotional intelligence, but it's very much focusing on yourself physically, mentally. However, if you also think of the impulse control, what was interesting about Michelle's work was the ones that were able to stay calm, if you will, not grab the marshmallow, what were they doing differently? Well, they were actually using distraction techniques. So rather than focusing on the marshmallow, what they wanted to eat, they turned around in their chair, they looked at somewhere else. So what I would be saying, how would you apply that to stay calm? Well, rather than focusing on the thing that's irritating your amygdala, irritating you, distract yourself, focus on something else.
That's great. Thanks, Colleen, for your question. Okay, and finally, our third question for Alan is from David in Dubai. And David asked, what are the challenges that you feel are inhibiting employees' full engagement with their leaders? That's an interesting one, Alan. What do you think?
Well, if you will, emotional intelligence is a set of trust-building behaviors. And if you will, this is exactly what it can help engagement, but also dampen it. People want to feel that they can trust the organization, trust their manager, trust their team. They want to feel they're making a contribution. They want to feel that it's transparent. Most importantly, they want to feel that they're listened to. They want to feel a connection, because you're not actually a leader if people don't follow you. Now they can, if you will, pretend to follow you, but if you have a title and you don't have engagement, you don't listen, you don't have empathic connections with your people, more than likely you are not leading, you are just gone for a walk on your own. So people want to feel that they were connected with. Now, empathy is different than sympathy. Most leaders shy away from it because they believe, I can't spend the whole time sympathizing with everyone. It's not about sympathizing. It's not even about agreeing. It's about connecting. It's about allowing the person to feel that you know what contribution they want to make and where they fit in. That will enhance engagement.
Fantastic. Okay, so that's about all we've got time for. I'm very sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but we will be sending a follow-up email with all of your Q&As answered by the lovely Alan afterwards. If you couldn't make this webinar, it'll be available 1 week from now on your local Morgan McKinley website under the Media Centre and Webinars. As always, we'd love to hear your feedback on this webinar, so please send it through to events@morganmckinley.com. And finally, just a big thank you to Alan for joining us again today and hosting another fantastic global webinar. And thank you to everyone for taking the time to tune in with us today. We really hope you enjoy the content and we hope to see you next time.